Thank you so much for tuning in to our last session, session 5. It's been quite a process and quite an incredible experience to learn and to understand from each other. I never imagined that this first webinar that we designed, it will go on as a continuing process. And now that we are in our third year, it feels quite enriching, and it feels quite that one feels very content that these sessions are coming into some kind of form of co-thinking, co-learning. I now introduce the session 5's title, Indigeneity and Climate Change, Heritage Preservation as a Blueprint for Contemporary Future Resilience, a topic very close to my heart, and it's my absolute pleasure to now introduce you to +921 Heritage Talks 2025 third webinar. I, Marvi Mazhar, architect based in Karachi, developed the project +921 Heritage Talks as a form of response to ongoing deterioration and decay in urban Karachi, where conversation around repair and maintenance is hugely missing. So it's also coming from a very self space. Pakistan Chowk Community Centre is an organization which has worked very hard since 2016 to be an advocate towards built environment, safeguarding public spaces, and establishing a strong stance towards preservation. Pakistan Chowk Community Centre strives to provide a space for community engagement, advancement of arts and culture, and a democratic literary discourse in Karachi, especially focusing on urban infrastructure and preservation discourse. +921 Heritage Talk is a project of Pakistan Chowk Community Centre, conceptualized and developed in 2023, where every year PCC hosts discussions and webinars dedicated to the politics of heritage and preservation in South Asia. This webinar is later viewed by students, researchers, and urban thinkers, and our YouTube channel is used by a lot of institutes as a reference point while teaching. So your knowledge becomes part of a larger network. So thank you again for taking out time and being part of this webinar. +921 Heritage Talk is an innovative South Asian perspective which unveils radical discussion through yearly student-led curated series on an online platform, bringing different practices together. PCC works hard to bring academics, bloggers, independent researchers, artists, architects, urban planners, policymakers, legal thinkers, anthropologists, journalists, and even fiction writers to come together to think about development, infrastructure, and ecology. We have a small secret here that how we do this and how we plan it out. It's a year-long process where we stalk many social media handles, and we try to gather that who's doing what interesting work. It's incredible that how social media has brought us so together and kind of brought us, and there are no like significant borders that one has to work with. So every time we've sent an invitation, it's exciting to hear back from a very positive response to be part of this session. So it's also like a community and allyship that we think we build upon. It's my absolute pleasure to open the third session of +921 Heritage Talks 2025 topic, which is post-colonial narratives in South Asia. Before any further ado, I now introduce PCC this year's team, who's worked very hard to put this project together. My lead curators are Syed Samil and Sana Waheed. Documentation and coordination, Shaheen Numan, who you may know or may not, but here we lovingly know she is known as Auntie Shaheen, who puts a lot of hard work in carrying the Heritage Walk Karachi projects for students, researchers, and visitors coming from outside to the city. And she opens a small window into looking at what our old town defines. She's our also very own whistleblower from field, so don't take her lightly. We cannot begin without acknowledging this year's dynamic team who's worked extremely hard on various sections like research, creativity, social media, and communication strategy, which means that our posters are very well thought. They have taken a while to come together, and they represent each session wholeheartedly. Syed Samil from Karachi University, Sana Waheed, Indus Valley School of Art and Architecture, Asad Zafar, Karachi Grammar School, Ishal Hassan Khan, BNU, Faiz Siddiqui, Karachi Grammar School, Siham Dadaboy, National College of Arts. The two of this incredible team are also from junior school and mid school. So that also means that our internship is quite thinks in a very different way. We don't even focus on just undergrad and graduate. We give chances to all kinds of thinkers to come together to learn from each other. So it's very exciting that how our babies have done really well. I call them babies, but of course they're self-independent people who have worked with us. So just a quick SOP before I let my curators start the session. I request the audience to keep their mics on mute. If you have any question or any suggestion, observation, or some case study that you know, please leave it in the chat box. I want to make the chat box more like a session of conversation, not just like a dead space. So please use and utilize that space. It'll be great to also for the speakers to kind of look at it and respond, or if you have any questions directly to them, please post it over there. When speakers finish presenting, we will open the space for audience to interact and expand more onto what's happening in the chat box. If not, that's also okay. We're okay both ways. Usually speakers share work for 15 to 20 minutes. Our moderator will give a signal when it's 12 or 15th minute. Have passed and give your gentle signal around 15th minute. Session is recorded and will be uploaded on our PCC YouTube channel. So from the audience, please have a look at it. It's called the Pakistan Chowk Community Centre on YouTube. I now welcome moderator to open our first exciting session, Indigeneity and Climate Change, Heritage Preservation as a Blueprint for Contemporary Future Resilience. On behalf of PCC friends, advisors, and ally, I welcome all the speakers who generously carved out time in different time zones. We totally respect your taking out your time from from wherever you are. Our audience who believe in our work, and I hope we continue such discussions in future. I thank all the speakers again on today's session. It means a lot for you to take out time and share your practice. Over to you, Sana and Siham. Thank you.
Thank you, Marvi. Hello, my name is Sana Wahid, and I'm one of the co-moderators for today's session. I will be introducing the brief for this webinar on the topic Indigeneity and Climate Change, Heritage Preservation as a Blueprint for Contemporary Future Resilience. The Global South bears a heavy burden of the climate crisis, a phenomenon that, while geophysical in its manifestation, is also profoundly political and historical. The legacy of colonialism has systematically dismantled indigenous epistemologies and severed communities from their reciprocal relationships with land, water, and biodiversity. We are actively witnessing the repercussions of environmental neglect washing up on the shores of the global south, amassing in landfills, poisoning water sources, and leaving communities vulnerable and exposed. In the urban landscape, we've lost parks, shorelines, and centuries old buildings that once bore witness to the transformation of nations and people, all in the name of development. Still rooted in the land, indigenous lifeways can be activated as vital forms of intangible cultural heritage as a means of climate resistance, safeguarding the intergenerational knowledge embedded in place, ritual, and ecological stewardship. Preserving heritage is not an act of nostalgia; it is a forward-looking strategy. The framework has been adopted as grassroots effort for restoring local and traditional practices across South Asia. Voices are being raised against ecological injustices while simultaneously advocating for the preservation of natural heritage and embracing adaptive reuse as a means of culturally metamorphosing spaces and rewiring our relationships with our environments. Architects, academics, designers, farmers, and activists across multiple disciplines are responding to climate colonialism by asserting localized, context rich alternatives within their respective fields. In the face of climate change, it is not enough to retrofit our cities. We must also decolonize our imaginations. This means unlearning colonial paradigms that alienate us from nature and re engaging with place based knowledge as a living archive of ecological intelligence and resilience. Indigeneity in this regard is not a static identity, but an ongoing praxis, one of inhabiting the world of dialogic, reparative, and interdependent ways. In protecting these traditions, we are not only conserving the past, but we are also cultivating blueprints for a sustainable future. This session aims to investigate how indigenous knowledge systems in the global south offer powerful frameworks for climate resilience. By referencing colonialism and its ongoing impact, we highlight how communities are reclaiming their heritage and ecological reciprocity. I will now request my co-moderator Seham to please introduce the speakers for today's session.
Thank you, Sana, for the kind introduction. For today's discussion, we are joined by a distinguished panel of speakers. We warmly welcome Rehman, Baneen, Mirza, Ifra Asif, and Palvasha Shahab. Thank you all for taking the time to be with us. It's truly an honor to have you here today. Without any further ado, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Palvasha Shahab. Palvasha Shahab is a doctoral student at the Department of History at Yale University. Her research examines the interplay between environmental and legal histories of the Indus River Delta. Prior to this, she's had over 8 years of experience as a social justice lawyer, researcher, and lecturer in Pakistan. She has authored articles, book chapters, reports, legal opinions, and publications for various academic, governmental, and non-governmental bodies. She has an LLM from Columbia Law School and a BA LLB from Lahore University of Management Sciences. She has also had fellowships at the Max Planck Institute for Legal History and Legal Theory and the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights. We welcome Palvasha to our conference. It's an honor to have you here with us today. Over to you.
Thank you so much for that overly generous introduction. I'm very grateful to be part of the conversation today. I hope that I'm able to contribute meaningfully to what I know is going to be an incredible conversation. What I will do is I'll quickly start with a few questions, and then we can sort of think through them together as we move forward. So as we begin, we're thinking about indigeneity in the climate justice context. Perhaps it's important to ask, what is indigenous knowledge? How can we relate it to climate change? Where should we look for indigenous knowledges? How can we understand moving between temporal and geographical scales, between the global and the local, when we speak of indigeneity? Who do we exclude? Who do we include in this indigenous knowledge making? And so as we proceed with these questions, or we begin thinking through them, I suggest that we undertake a reflexive reading on knowledge circulation, on legal histories and legal geographies, to think through these problems. Through a concurrent reading of the scholarship on knowledge accumulation and circulation, through legislative experimentation that took place in Calcutta, the capital of the Bengal presidency, and the seat of the East India Company till the mid to late 19th century, one can glimpse a trajectory and the convergence of locally informed but colonially motivated knowledge production and lawmaking. One example that comes to mind is the temporally proximate establishment of the Royal Asiatic Society in 1784 by William Jones, a judge of the Supreme Court of Judicature in Calcutta, and the coming of Bengal's permanent settlement regulations of 1793. Collectively, looking through these literatures can offer a useful scaffolding for understanding the sort of infrastructures, both physical and legal, that lead us to the kind of river water management that we see today, and the problems we're having with it with respect to climate justice and or the unfolding climate crisis for that matter. So what I'll do during this time is that I'll first discuss Sindh's environmental landscape, and then move on to a brief exploration of what we mean when we say indigenous knowledge and its contribution to and subjugation by modern government. On the question of governance, I'll take a small dip into the legal histories. It's a hazard of who I've been and working as, and of having been a lawyer, that I sort of do have to think through these. And then I'll sort of conclude by inviting the conversation to respond to the urgency of the climate crisis with slowness, to think and move gradually, slowly, meaningfully through space, through scale, through time, and perhaps, if nothing else, to critically understand where our laws and knowledges are embedded, where they're coming from, and how they can be reoriented and brought in conversation with indigenous knowledge or ideas of indigeneity to address the contemporary climate crisis. So as we begin placing ourselves amidst the climate crisis unfolding in Sindh, evidently climate change does not abide by national boundaries. But of course, some, as has been mentioned earlier, are more vulnerable than others. So according to the IPCC report of 2022, Pakistan falls within a high risk or very high risk region vis-a-vis several aspects of climate change. Consequently, Pakistan is staring down what has been called even an existential crisis. On the one hand, 30 lakes in northern Pakistan are presently at risk of bursting, endangering a 7.1 million lives. And on the other hand, rising heat across the country is threatening to kill. And when we look at southern Pakistan, it is alternatively wrecked by drought and flood, as we well know. Within this precious landscape, when we look at the Indus Delta, it is particularly vulnerable. Situated in southern Sindh, it is spread across Baneen, Thatta, Sajawal, and the megacity of Karachi primarily, although historically, of course, it has been charted from Multan downwards, but of course, maps and geographies change with time. Sindh itself gets its name and identity from the river, of course, and for Sindh to bear witness to a dying Indus River is a very violent notion. It is threatening for survival and habitation as it is for sacral and meaning-making practices. So it is not just a matter of bare life surviving or existing, but also for the kind of identities and for the kind of deities and the kind of ritual practices that are associated with the Indus. The Indus has now, of course, as many of us already know, been engineered within an inch of its life. It is home to one of the largest networks of contiguous canals in the world. Hassan Karar, in a 2021 article, notes that most believe that the state has decided to let the delta run dry. A colonial officer's century-old observation continues to ring true today. He says, many local people were driven to migrate by the gradual impoverishment of villages. And this is something that we seem to be seeing 100 years later as well. The Indus Delta has always been vulnerable to the mighty flows of the Indus River. It's not like the Indus has ever stayed in one path. It's always been a moving river, as most relatively younger rivers, but also generally it's just the natural ebb and flow of the way rivers and water bodies are. Today, rising salinity, dumping of toxic waste have killed ecosystems of freshwater lakes around the delta. 70% of the mangroves that secured the delta have been destroyed. In Baneen, the most vulnerable union councils, the Bugra Mehman, the Ahmed Rajo, and the Kadhan, witness tidal waves of the sea come in twice a day without fail. No one expects the situation to get better, as Karar notes. However, it is difficult to imagine that abandoning the delta is the government's end goal, or that it's an acceptable possible outcome. The fortified networks of canals and barrages upstream will eventually fall into disrepair, or if and when the Indus does not reach the sea anymore. And as deltaic river flows dwindle, seawater is going to increasingly encroach on the land, infiltrating groundwater lakes, other sources of fresh water, and so on. The state believes that any river flowing that doesn't feed agriculture or industry is a waste of resources. This is, of course, a colonial hangover from what is identified as waste and what is identified as a wasteland and so forth. Partially, this can be understood as David Gilmartin suggests as a vast Faustian bargain with nature, in which state power and hubris of state knowledge is deeply morally implicated. Here, there are also other plans afoot. If you look at the government publications, there is a new port city named Zulfikarabad that is planned where once Katie Bandar flourished. And this is again something that that Karar points out in his article. And if the present deltaic population disappears or dies out, new inhabitants could be settled there, as they were settled in the past. Amidst this deltaic devastation, in a 2019 report, the World Bank predicted a prosperous Pakistan with flourishing Indus Delta no less if it continued to develop as per their advice. Each new development appears as a placeholder, in this case, discussing development to delay discussing justice. Neither Katie Bandar nor Zulfikarabad would survive if the Indus stopped flowing to the sea. Instead, the Arabian Sea would accelerate its encroachment on the Indus. This chilling prospect begs us to ask, on the spectrum between paralysis and praxis, where should we respond to these pasts, presents, and futures? Many among us have pointed to indigenous knowledges, indigenous frameworks in order to address this moment of crisis. The quest for indigenous knowledges is particularly evident in the last quarter of the 20th century as an outcome of several factors, but mostly defined by a disenchantment with modern science and the developmental imagination. Nevertheless, of course, the developmentalism persists, but these are voices that have already started coming out in the last quarter of the 20th century. But what do we mean when we say indigenous knowledge? So when we look at the corpus of modern science or Western science or the science that is being employed to make these developmental frameworks, whether they're canals or laws and so forth, or they're enmeshed relationship, we find that much has already been extracted and synthesized from indigenous knowledges into modern Western science. Richard Grove in Green Imperialism, for example, uses the example of the Hortus Malabaricus, published in 1678, between 1678 and 1693, as a key example of how colonial scientific enterprise involved deep collaboration with indigenous knowledge systems, particularly in the context of botany and medicine. In Beyond Science and Empire, which is an anthology of different essays, we see several rich examples, one being the exchange of botanical knowledge between Kew Gardens and Calcutta's botanical gardens. So how do we differentiate then? And this is generally also the thrust of the arguments made within the knowledge circulation literature, where we keep seeing how much indigenous knowledge is what the larger corpus of Western scientific knowledge even relies on and extracts from. How do we then differentiate in real terms? Is it the fact that indigenous knowledge is place-based? Is it temporally anchored versus modern Western science, for example, or other ways of knowing, hegemonic ways of knowing being universal? Is it that it is the conception between community, society, and environment that is differentiating indigenous knowledge from other ways of, or from the hegemonic ways of knowing? What do we mean in temporal and geographical terms? Is it that it is secular? Is it the absence of the sacral in modern Western science that differentiates it from being indigenous? And when we say indigenous, who do we exclude? Who do we include? What is its democratic credibility? To what extent can we even recover indigenous knowledges now that they have been painted over by so many other ways of social organization, of travel, of knowledge transfer? And if we do so, then what would they look like now? Is it that we can say that an evolving indigenous knowledge has continued to develop despite the hegemony of Western modern science, however one may choose to phrase it? Perhaps so. That very well might be, but the problems emerging from climate change are very new. They are the result of very particular Faustian bargain, if I'm to use Gilmartin's term, with nature. And perhaps the indigenous knowledges that may have at least slowed their pace of evolution with the hegemony of modern Western science are or are not equipped to sufficiently address the very urgent and grave problems of climate justice and climate change in the moment. How much can we use indigenous knowledge frameworks that evolved through a different sense of scale? They were very locally oriented. Where do we draw those boundaries of the local anyway? How do we go between the local and the global? Is there something in between that we're missing? What are we imagining in terms of a conversation when we pitch indigenous knowledge in front of the Goliath that is modern Western science? When we look through these lenses of knowledge circulation, of law and society and their mutually reinforcing relationships, how should we locate indigenous knowledge? So to take a step back, between the 16th and the 19th century, the world's population doubled. Land usage intensified to unprecedented levels. Disparate polities consolidated into nation states. Through a trial and error process of social learning, they came to a greater control over natural resources, over labor, over trade, over public order. Increased human mobility also, especially through maritime trade, brought several biological invasions that were fully alien to the lands that they were arriving in. They took the form of pandemics on new shores. They took the form of pests to crops. And there were different responses that indigenous knowledge, I mean, there were responses and reactions that indigenous knowledge may or may not have been fully equipped to deal with, but was obfuscated by the kind of militaristic responses or the kind of forceful responses that came from the newly emerging forms of governance. And certain marine and terrestrial animals became commodities, landscapes became commodities, and so forth. This is a familiar picture for most of us who are in the conversation today. But then what lies between the local and the global? When we look at these sort of mobilities, when we look at these sort of movements over the past 500 or so odd years, the terms indigenous knowledge, colonial law, Western science are often used to denote mutually exclusive frameworks with influence over social environments that were respectively either lost by the colonized or that were imposed on by the colonizer during periods of colonization and, of course, continue in the post-colonial period. An example of this is, of course, as mentioned earlier, the activist and scholarly calls to turn to indigenous knowledges. And of course, we are sort of contending with that today as well. Instead, what we perhaps can also like sort of expand our realm of conversation to is to understand that the common use of the term indigenous knowledge often still presumes, even though the framing of this conversation is very notably different, but the thrust of these conversations often still presume that indigenous knowledge is clearly and fully different from Eurocentric Western hegemonic knowledges. There is a common understanding that also prescribes a fixity and stability to the content of indigenous knowledge as if it were a self-referential whole. B, a sort of purity to indigenous knowledge as if it were unadulterated by other cultures and languages and influences. And if we were just to take the example of the ways that the Persian wheel has traveled through South India, through East India, through just within the Indian subcontinent in so many different ways and forms, one could perhaps, of course, see counterexamples in so many other things. And C, it is assumed that it is communally driven and uniquely suited to local needs. On the other hand, of course, colonial or Western laws and science is understood as an alien system of norms that diffused through the colonies, which was largely European, predominantly utilitarian, and obstinately global in its form. It was enacted as it was evolving and responding to governance needs of the colonies and continues to be institutionally driven. And to mix and evolve with post-colonial states, but remains steadfastly alien in form and not local at its core. Notwithstanding these and other complexities, these ideas enforce certain dichotomies about the local and the global, about stasis and evolution, and shroud our understanding of the multi-directional relationships between knowledge, law, society, and community and their environment. On another note, perhaps it's also interesting to pay attention to the sort of circular and dialogic ways in which knowledge travels, whilst remaining, of course, equally attentive to the power structures that underpin it. For example, in June-July 1999, UNESCO planned a world conference for science for the, it was titled Science for the 21st Century, a New Commitment, and this was held in Budapest. In the concluding recommendations, it suggested, number one, establish an international initiative for the conservation and promotion of indigenous civilizational knowledge systems to enable member states to recognize, protect, and promote such knowledge systems. Two, design a series, and this is where it gets slightly more complicated. Design a series of projects that would recognize the range of influence and economic value of technologies either residing in indigenous and civilizational knowledge systems or emerging from the grassroots. Innovations and study how best and reward such intellectual property, leading to a revised international convention on the protection of intellectual property rights, with special emphasis on indigenous and civilizational knowledge. In an uncanny similarity, in January 1784, so quite a while before 1999, the Royal Asiatic Society, modeled on the Royal Society of London, received its address based on certain objects of inquiry from the founder, William Jones, who I had briefly mentioned before. And he exhorted all curious and learned men to, I quote, correct the geographies of Asia by new observations and discoveries, trace the annals and even the traditions of those nations who from time to time have peopled or desolated it, bring to light their various forms of government within their institutional and civil, within their institutions, civil and religious. Examine their improvements and methods in arithmetic and geometry, in trigonometry, mensuration, mechanics, optics, astronomy, and general physics. Their systems of morality, grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic. Their skill, archaeology, and medicine. Their advancement, whatever it may be, in anatomy and chemistry. To this you will add researches to their agriculture, manufacture, and trade, whilst you inquire with pleasure into their music, architecture, painting, and poetry, will not neglect those inferior arts, by which the comforts and elegance of social life are supplied or improved. There is, I would posit, a strong similarity in a continuing extractiveness when we think about using indigenous knowledge. While it is, of course, incredibly important to look towards ritual and practice, it is also important not to take indigenous knowledge out of its sacral, its communal, its locational, its spatial, its temporal relationships. And perhaps when one joins in global conversations, one must remain very, very vigilant and aware of how these conversations may be co-opted, used, extracted from, synthesized from in the future. One example with respect to intellectual property rights that is coming to my mind is the recent, well, not so recent, patenting of turmeric for its medicinal uses, which of course we know has been a communal sort of herb that's used for several medicinal and other uses for centuries. So when we bring these conversations to the fore, we must think through them. And we must understand that knowledge making, whether it results in natural sciences or in lawmaking, is deeply tied to governmentality, to use Foucault's term. And governmentality in Gyan Prakash's words in his book, from his book Another Reason, came to colonial India. So governmentality in British India, like governmentality in Europe, also developed in response to the outbreak of epidemics, death, and famines, was directed to act on the population, nurture its health, cultivate its resources. And colonial governmentality, however, could not, and so therefore it was not encumbered with the task of constructing hegemony the way it perhaps was in Europe, because it was already coming within a certain power dynamic. And so I quote again, in colonial India, science was not encumbered with the task of constructing hegemony. Thus, it could be used as an aspect of what Foucault calls governmentality. Foucault writes, to govern a state will therefore mean to apply economy to set up an economy at the level of the entire state, which means exercising towards its inhabitants and the wealth and behavior of all a form of surveillance and control as attentive as that of the head of the family over his household and his goods. Governmentality means a pastoral form of power, and its chief concern is the population, which becomes available as a category understood through census, classifications, famine mortality, epidemiological surveys, regulations, laws, statistics, and so forth. The purpose of this form of power, as Foucault says, is to apply economy and maintain a healthy and productive population. When the state is governmentalized, have I gone on too long? Sorry, would
Yeah,
somebody?
you're like 7 minutes above.
Okay. I'm going to stop there, though. I think I'm
If you
just
would
going to
like
quickly
to
wrap up,
conclude.
if
Yeah,
that's okay. Yeah. Okay,
yeah.
great. So when we think about these things, we must think about how how deeply this idea of governmentality is then tied to lawmaking, to the movement of laws. How then through the 19th century do water management, irrigation laws, ostensibly aloof from a very watery, ever-morphing topography of Bengal, traveled west to a much drier Sindh? How it travels along the Hooghly and the Ganges and finally to the river Indus. And I'm going to skip over the sort of parts on legal history at the moment, just to come to a conclusion. In the Indus Delta, indigenous wisdoms have been buried deep. Modes of community before being ordered into legal categories on individual labor, individual ownership have been obscured. Sindh is exhausted, economically, physically, mentally. Many interviews reveal that people close to the Delta die and age much younger. They're subject to a lot more disease. Many stuck in the floods of 2022 could not recall the scenes from the floods of 2010. They do not find the continuities because the strain of the moment of the today is so intense. Many, of course, have migrated and seek survival elsewhere. What remains are memories of how prosperous and vibrant the Indus Delta once was. Many of the interviews and other archival sources have revealed peculiar modes of remembering also. In most cases, there is glorifying of a distant past, but forgetting of the recent past. In instances, some could only remember their life from flood to flood, intermittently dotted by droughts. It seems important if floods were big and well-reported one. Sorry. The distant memories help articulate what ought to be. And this is where indigeneity and memories of the past are so important. The past helps, in Karar's words, to calibrate expectations of a just present. Recently, memories have gravely reminded us of what that needs to be. If synergies of those memories were consolidated and that wisdom and modes were slowly unearthed and centered, brought into conversation with the contemporary, there might still be hope for the Indus and its children. These possibilities emerged in people's tribunals, in other collective forms of remembering, knowing, that are not necessarily and immediately tied to the global. Globally, of course, responses to climate crisis might be ushering in a paradigmatic shift in the ways in which the existing presumptions of our current corpus of knowledge are being questioned. A major reason for this imminent shift is that climate change does not abide by linear causality. Several causes, each beginning at a different time, at a different place, can result in one or more climate events and disasters of varying intensity at different times. Causes and effects cannot be joined with the absolute certainty that modern science wants us to always hold true. As a result, climate change neither allows for a simple but-for causation that lawyers are used to, nor indulges the scientists' contemporary desire for certitude. There is here an invitation to study the plurality of relationships between law, between livelihood, between knowledge making and environment globally and in the Indus River Delta in southern Sindh. Once an emblem of ecological and epistemological diversity and prosperity, the Indus Delta now fluctuates between drought and flood, but perhaps there are other ways of seeing and knowing and doing, but cautious ways, slow ways, ways that find the spaces between the local and the global. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Palvasha. Really, really, really amazing outline to start off and kick off our own session. Really heavy stuff to even think through. But this was a great outline to kind of bring a tone to today's session. It really sets a really interesting foreground for us to even think and navigate what it means for all these methods that you just kind of deconstructed and opened for us. So again, thank you so much. We'll come back to you for more questions in our last section. Over to you, Siham.
Thank you, Marvi. Yeah, questions will be taken in the chat box. And also please mention who you would like to address your question to. Yeah, so next up we have Abdul Rehman. Abdul Rehman is a slow fashion designer and a researcher who works at the intersection of indigenous cultures and shared South Asian nostalgia, literature and art and fashion. He is the founder of a slow fashion label, Angan, which promotes locally inspired sustainable fashion. He has recently authored a landmark countrywide report on sustainable fashion in Pakistan. His latest engagement is Stringent, a collective for communal research, education, and awareness, through which he is currently organizing workshops on sustainable fashion and textile. He also documents oral and visual culture of medieval Punjabi literature. So yeah, over to you, Abdul Rehman. Thank you for being here.
Hello everyone, and I'm sorry my camera stopped working. I don't know how, and I'm not good with technology. And thank you so much, Siham, for this kind introduction. And Marvi and her amazing team of extraordinary individuals who are organizing this wonderful conference every year with a powerful lineup. So मेरा camera नहीं चल रहा तो मैं फौरन से screen share कर लेता हूँ अपनी. Give me a minute. Okay. Share. Is it working?
Yes, it's working.
Oh, perfect. So अभी I guess बहुत informative बातें हुई हैं. इफ्रा और पलवशा ने जो की और पलवशा ने अभी बहुत सारी जो बातें की उनमें एक रिकरिंग बात थी कि sustainability, sustainable lifestyle, solutions to climate change और जो preservation और conservation है उसके जो उसके जो वेस्टर्न कॉन्सेप्ट्स हैं और आइडियाज़ हैं और जो हम अब तक जिन सबको पढ़ते भी आए हैं और जिनके थ्रू ही हम अपने काम डॉक्यूमेंट भी करते आए हैं, तो उसको भी कितना ज़रूरी है अनलर्न करना भी और उसको एक तरफ छोड़ना अगर हम लोकलाइज सॉल्यूशंस ढूंढने की तरफ जाते हैं अपने यहाँ पर जो कि अपने रीजन के लिए जो कि क्लाइमेट क्राइसिस को लेके बहुत वल्नरेबल है और सबसे ज़्यादा उसका असर झेल रहा है जबकि हमारा कंट्रीब्यूशन रिलेटिवली बहुत कम है. तो ये भी एक एक अनदर पूरी एक डिबेट है कि किस तरह से जो प्रोडक्शन प्रोसेसेस हैं उनके अंदर वेस्ट अगर सस्टेनेबल हो रहा है तो अपने अपने जो प्रोडक्शन प्रोसेसेस की इन्वायरमेंटल और सोशल कॉस्ट है वो किस तरह से आउटसोर्स कर रहा है हमारे जैसे मुल्कों में, क्योंकि और उनकी उनकी फॉर एग्जांपल आई वर्क विद फैशन, तो उनकी जो फैशन इंडस्ट्री है उसके लिए पाकिस्तान एक मेजर टेक्सटाइल सप्लायर है, और उनकी जो वेस्ट की बहुत सारी फैशन और टेक्सटाइल इंडस्ट्री है उसकी जो प्रोडक्शन है वो पाकिस्तान में हो रही होती है। तो किस तरह से जो उसमें वर्कफोर्स है काम करने वाली उनके राइट्स एक्सप्लॉइट होते हैं, और फिर हमारे हवा मिट्टी पानी को भी किस तरह से नुकसान पहुंचता है। और फिर जब वो फैशन वेस्ट में कंज्यूम हो जाता है, जो फास्ट फैशन जो यहीं पर बहुत सस्ते दामों बना होता है हमारे माहौल लोगों और कल्चर को एक्सप्लॉइट करके, वो बहुत कम पहन कर, बिकॉज फास्ट फैशन इज डिस्पोजेबल, तो उनको कहीं डिस्पोज करना है तो वो डंप की सूरत में हमारे जैसे मुल्कों में भेज देते हैं। तो किस तरह से मल्टीपल पॉसिबल वे में वो ऐसे छोटे मुल्कों को उनके उनके जो क्लाइमेट चेंज के अंदर कंट्रीब्यूट कर रहे हैं किस तरह से, और खुद ये क्लेम कर रहे हैं कि वो क्लाइमेट फ्रेंडली प्रैक्टिसेस अपना रहे हैं। तो इसलिए भी मुझे ऐसा लगता है कि हमें बहुत सारे ऐसे कॉन्सेप्ट्स को अनलर्न और लर्न करने के लिए अनलर्न करना और उसको रीलर्न करना बड़ा ज़रूरी है। और उसकी और क्यों भी ज़रूरी है, क्यों ये ख्याल मुझे क्यों आता है, क्योंकि जब मैं ये अर्बन डेवलपमेंट को देखता हूँ जो हमारे आसपास हो रही है या सारे इंटरनेशनली, भले फ्रेमवर्क्स की बात हुई थी अभी इफ्रा ने ये एक पॉइंट मेंशन किया कि किस तरह से सस्टेनेबिलिटी के फ्रेमवर्क्स डेवलप हुए हैं। तो लाहौर में मैं कुछ अरसे से एक घर देख रहा हूँ जो कि एक बहुत फेमस आर्किटेक्ट ने बनाया जिसको प्लेटिनम अवार्ड मिला है, द मोस्ट सस्टेनेबल एक वो जो घर बना हुआ है पाकिस्तान के अंदर। और उसको मैंने विजिट किया तो उसके अंदर जो जितने भी मटेरियल्स यूज़ हुए हैं, मैं उनको सोचा था जो पेंट उसमें यूज़ हुआ है, जो इंडस्ट्रियल मटेरियल्स कंक्रीट और लोहा और बहुत सारा मटेरियल यूज़ हुआ है, वो बनने के अंदर पूरे माहौल को किस तरह से नुकसान पहुंचाते हुए वो इस घर की कंस्ट्रक्शन के अंदर वो शामिल हुए हैं। और बाद में भी वो किस तरह से माहौल को नुकसान पहुंचा रहे हैं। जैसे इफ्रा ने भी मेंशन किया कि जो हाउसिंग है वो कितनी ज़्यादा उसकी एनर्जी कंजम्पशन है और कितनी ज़्यादा एनर्जी कंज्यूम करी है। तो ये जो हमारी अर्बन डेवलपमेंट सो कॉल्ड डेवलपमेंट की ये जो चंद शक्लें हैं, एक एरियल व्यू है कराची का ही, किस तरह से डेवलपमेंट को फैलाई जा रहे हैं। बहुत बड़े बड़े शहर हैं और वो फैलते जा रहे हैं और ज़्यादा। फिर जो इंडस्ट्री है, जिस तरह की इंडस्ट्री है वो किस तरह काम कर रही है और वो हमारे माहौल को किस तरह से नुकसान पहुंचा रही है। और साथ में जो एक लैंडस्केप है पूरा शहरों का, ये जो ये जो बिल्डिंग्स हैं, ये स्टेटमेंट्स हैं एक हमारी तरक्की की और पावर की। और मुझे ऐसा अक्सर महसूस होता है कि ये एक ऐसी स्टेटमेंट भी हैं कि जो एक सिस्टम की स्टेटमेंट हैं जिसके सामने इंसान अपने आप को बहुत छोटा महसूस करे, और जो भी बीइंग्स हैं जो लिविंग बीइंग्स हैं वो अपने आप को बहुत छोटा फील करें और ये सिस्टम बड़ा हमें नज़र आए। तो अगर इसमें और ऐसे सारे फ्रेमवर्क्स में हमें सोल्यूशन नहीं नज़र आता तो फिर हमें सोल्यूशन कहाँ ढूंढने की ज़रूरत पड़ती है। तो उसके लिए जो सारी अब शुरू में भी बात हुई, और जैसे सना ने इस सेशन को ओपन करते हुए भी बोला कि जो इंडिजिनस प्रैक्टिसेस हैं वो किस तरह से इनहेरेंटली सस्टेनेबल रही हैं। और उसकी वजह सिर्फ ये नहीं है कि हम एक बैकवर्ड लुकिंग एक नॉस्टैल्जिया है और उसके साथ कोई रोमांस जुड़ा है, जो कि मेरा तो रोमांस भी जुड़ा है। मैं अक्सर ये बात करता हूँ क्योंकि मुझे ऐसा लगता है कि बहुत एस्थेटिकली प्लीजिंग भी हैं और बड़ी प्रोपोर्शनल हैं जो इंडिजिनस प्रैक्टिसेस हैं, वो घर बनाने की हों, कपड़े पहनने की हों या खाने पीने की हों। लेकिन क्यों हम उनकी तरफ जाते हैं, क्योंकि उसकी वजह शायद ये मुझे समझ आती है कि उन्होंने उन कम्युनिटीज़ ने नेचर के साथ हज़ारों साल एक वक्त गुजारा है, नेचर के साथ रहे हैं, नेचर के करीब रहे हैं और उन्होंने कोएग्जिस्ट करना सीखा है हार्मनी में दरख्तों, हवा, पानी, परिंदों और जानवरों के साथ। और इस सेशन के शुरू में पलवशा ने जो डेल्टा के बारे में बातें की कि किस तरह से एक नेचर के ऐसे रिसोर्सेज जो हमेशा से जेनरस और काइंड रहे हैं, अब किस तरह से उन्हीं से हमें नुकसान पहुंच रहा है हमारी अपनी ह्यूमन इंटरवेंशंस की वजह से। तो इसकी समझ हमें क्यों नहीं आती कई दफ़ा इतने डेवलप्ड, सो कॉल्ड डेवलप्ड सेटिंग्स में बैठकर। तो और जैसे अभी अगर आजकल डेल्टा की बात हो रही है, तो हमारे यहाँ लाहौर में तो ये डिबेट चलती है कि क्या ही मसला है, पानी ज़ाया हो रहा है सारा और वो समंदर में चला जाएगा, तो उसको किसी तरह यूटिलाइज ही कर लें। इस तरह की बातें और ये सारे नैरेटिव्स मुझे ऐसा लगता है इसीलिए आते हैं क्योंकि हमारा ताल्लुक नहीं रहा नेचर के साथ और नेचर के सारे एलिमेंट्स के साथ। तो इस वजह से भी ये बहुत अहम हो जाता है कि हम अपने कंफर्ट जोन से निकल कर विज़िट करें और विज़िट करें ऐसी जगहों को, जैसे सना ने शुरू में कहा है। और ऐसी जगहों को क्यों? क्योंकि जो इंडिजिनस प्रैक्टिसेस हैं वो स्टैटिक नहीं हैं और वो अभी भी हैं, प्रैक्टिस हो रही हैं किसी न किसी फॉर्म में, बल्कि और डेवलप हुई हैं वक्त के साथ, वक्त की ज़रूरतों के साथ। तो इन इलाकों में, इन जगहों पर, शहरों से दूर ऐसी सेटिंग्स में जो नेचर के करीब रह रही हैं कम्युनिटीज़, उनको जाकर देखना और उनसे सीखना और अपने सीखे हुए पहलू को अनलर्न करना ज़रूरी हो जाता है कि वो किस तरह से ज़िंदगी गुजार रहे हैं नेचर के करीब रहते हुए। तो उसी में जो पिछले कुछ सालों की मेरी फील्ड विजिट्स हैं अपनी रिसर्च के लिए, जो मोस्टली कल्चर्स और फैशन और टेक्सटाइल प्रैक्टिसेस के ऊपर है, बस इसमें ऑफ कोर्स लिटरेचर के साथ साथ आर्किटेक्चर प्रैक्टिसेस, उनकी घर बनाने की, रहने की और खाने पीने की भी नज़र में आती रही हैं। तो अभी ये एक पहली एक इमेज अगर आप देख रहे हो तो इसमें कैसे जो कम्युनिटीज़ रूरल सेटिंग्स में रह रही हैं उनके घर बनाने की दो शक्लें नज़र आ रही हैं। एक लेफ़्ट साइड के ऊपर एक चौरा झोंपड़ी सी बनी हुई है, जो ये थर के गांव की तस्वीर है, जो उनका एक ट्रेडिशनल आर्किटेक्चर है, वहाँ का घर बनाने का तरीका है कि वो, और ये ज़ीरो कॉस्ट है बिकॉज ये मिट्टी से दीवार बनी है गोल, और गोल इसलिए बनी है क्योंकि हवाएं भी तेज चलती हैं और एक सहरा में, और हवा घर को एक धक्का दे सकती है और उसके स्ट्रक्चर को या तो गिरा सकती है अगर कमज़ोर होगा, या उसको कमज़ोर कर सकती है उसकी बुनियादों को। और अगर सैलाब आते हैं, पानी तेज़ी से आएगा और वो एक सीधा स्ट्रक्चर है तो उसको वो जोर लगाकर गिरा सकता है या कमज़ोर कर सकता है। कुछ तो ये जो गोल स्ट्रक्चर है वो एक मदद देता उन्हें, एक क्लाइमेट रेजिलियंट स्ट्रक्चर है कि हवा और पानी उसके आसपास से गुजर जाता है घर को गिराए बगैर। और ऊपर की जो छत है वो इस तरह से बनाई गई है कि अगर बारिश का पानी भी आए तो ऊपर से यूं ही गुजर जाए। और ये घर अंदर से गर्मियों में, क्योंकि काफ़ी मोटी दीवारें हैं, मिट्टी की हैं, पोरस दीवारें हैं, तो अंदर से गर्मियों में रिलेटिवली ठंडा रहता है और सर्दियों में थोड़ा वार्म हो जाता है और अंदर वो आग भी जला लेते हैं। अब ये एक घर का स्ट्रक्चर है और राइट साइड पे घरों का वो स्ट्रक्चर है जो भी थोड़ी देर पहले भी दोनों स्पीकर्स ने कुछ बातें की हैं कि किस तरह से हमारे कॉन्सेप्ट्स बदल रहे हैं और हम क्लाइमेट चेंज को किस तरह से डील करना है और क्या सॉल्यूशंस होने चाहिए और सस्टेनेबल सॉल्यूशंस क्या होते हैं। मुझे सारी डिस्कशंस और डिबेट्स हैं वो जब गांव में पहुंचती हैं और हम शहरों के पढ़े लिखे लोग उनको जाके बताते हैं कि पक्के घर सॉल्यूशन है, क्योंकि और नुआंसेस को समझे बगैर और पक्के घर क्यों ज़रूरी हैं या क्या मदद दे सकते हैं और किस तरह से दोनों के दरमियान कोई ऐसा सॉल्यूशन निकाला जा सकता है जो उनके घर को मजबूत भी बनाए और लेकिन उनकी बाकी ज़रूरतों को भी पूरा करे। लेकिन ये जब वो पक्के घर बनाते हैं, अभी उन्होंने ये पक्का घर बनाया हुआ है एक, तो मैंने उनसे पूछा कि अगर आपने ये पक्का घर बनाया है तो ये क्यों बनाया है, तो उन्होंने यही बोला कि वही शहर से पढ़े लिखे लोग हमें आते रहें और बताते रहें कि आप एजुकेट करते रहें कि आपके घर बारिश सैलाब में गिर जाएंगे तो आप पक्के घर बनाएं जो मजबूत होंगे। तो फिर मैंने कहा चलो ये तो बहुत अच्छी बात है, हमने पक्का घर बना लिया, तो आप इन्हें जो साथ का चौरा है वो गिरा क्यों नहीं देते। तो उन्होंने फ़ौरन मुझसे बोला कि जब बहुत ज़्यादा गर्मी होती है तो तब भी हम इसमें चले जाते हैं, और जब बहुत ज़्यादा सर्दी होती है तो तब भी हम इसमें चले जाते हैं, क्योंकि ये एक्सट्रीम वेदर्स में हमें सपोर्ट देता है। भले ही ये जो दूसरा घर है मॉडर्न रिलेटिवली ये मजबूत ज़्यादा है, तो इससे, और ये भी है कि अब उन्होंने घर में फ्रिज भी रखी है और पंखा भी, जो कि पहले उनको ज़रूरत नहीं पड़ती थी, और जो कच्चे वाला घर है उसमें उनके खाने फ्रेश रहते थे एक दिन तक, लेकिन पक्के घर में गर्मी से खाने भी ख़राब होते हैं, तो अब उन्हें ये सारी चीज़ें भी लेनी पड़ी। तो इससे मुझे फिर एक ख़्याल आता था कि क्या उनकी वाकई ज़रूरत थी, या एक कंसर्न मैन्युफैक्चर किया जा रहा था क्योंकि एक इंडस्ट्री लग गई है ईंटें बनाने की, दरवाज़ों की, छतों के मटेरियल की, पंखों की और रेफ्रिजरेटर्स की, तो उनको वो सारी चीज़ें बेचनी हैं, तो एक नीड क्रिएट की जा रही है। तो इसी से निहाल जो पहले सेशन में एक स्पीकर थे, उन्होंने इस पे बहुत एक इंटरेस्टिंग पूरी डिस्कशन की थी, जिसमें उन्होंने बहुत अच्छे से समझाया कि किस तरह से ये जो मॉडर्न आर्किटेक्चरल स्टाइल्स हैं, ये सिस्टम के लिए किस तरह से ज़रूरी हैं, और इंसान को ये जो हम सारे लोग हैं वो सिस्टम के कंट्रोल में रहें, उसके लिए कैसे ज़रूरी हैं। जैसे ये जो पहली बिल्डिंग है राइट साइड पे, इतनी बड़ी अपार्टमेंट बिल्डिंग है, अगर
अब्दुल,
इतनी
मैं
बड़ी
थोड़ा सा टाइम कीप करके मैं आपको बोलूंगी कि टाइम थोड़ा चेक कर लें।
ठीक है, I'm keeping an eye on that. कितने मिनट रह गए मेरे भला?
10 मिनट्स रह गए हैं आपके पास।
हाँ, ठीक है, परफेक्ट। सो ये जो बिल्डिंग्स हैं, ये जो इस तरह की बिल्डिंग्स हैं, उनकी क्योंकि एनर्जी कंजम्पशन भी उन बिल्डिंग्स की ज़्यादा है, और इसमें आपको एक लिफ्ट की ज़रूरत भी पड़ेगी, क्योंकि इतनी ज़्यादा स्टोरीज आप सीढ़ियों से नहीं चढ़ सकते, और इस तरह से और इसकी बहुत सारी ज़रूरतें हैं, जिस वजह से आप अगर उसमें रह रहे हैं तो उसके इतने ज़्यादा मेंटेनेंस के एक्सपेंडिचर्स हैं कि आपको उसी सिस्टम के अंदर वो 9 to 5 काम करना है। अगर आप चाहते हैं कि आप अपना कोई क्रिएटिव काम करें और उस वाले सिस्टम के अंदर नहीं रहें, तो इस घर में रहते हुए वो पॉसिबल नहीं होगा। सो इसके बाद और मेरे कुछ जो विज़िट किए हैं फील्ड में, उसमें ये एक गांव है, इस कंपैरिजन में कि जो हमारी शहरों की ज़िंदगी है और गांव की ज़िंदगी है, उसमें क्या फ़र्क है और वहाँ पे सीखने को क्या बातें हैं हमारे लिए। अभी ये गांव है, मेरी फैमिली इसी गांव से है। ये पाकपतन के करीब एक मलकाहांस टाउन, इसके पास एक छोटा सा गांव है। उसका एक गूगल मैप्स पे ये व्यू है, जिससे मैं दिखाना चाह रहा हूँ। इसमें 150 से 200 घर हैं इस गांव में, और मैं इसको बहुत ज़्यादा विजिट करता रहा हूँ, यहाँ पे मैं रहा भी हुआ हूँ, तो मुझे ये बहुत एक सरप्राइजिंग चीज़ लगती है, बिकॉज़ मैं लाहौर में रहता हूँ, तो उसके कंपैरिजन में कि यहाँ पे जो पानी है, गंदा पानी जो भी घरों के इस्तेमाल से बाहर निकलता है, उसको कहीं पर भी वो वाटर बॉडीज़ में नहीं जाता, जाने की ज़रूरत नहीं पड़ती, क्योंकि गाँव इतना छोटा है, तो वो सारा वो बहता हुआ फसलों के अंदर इस्तेमाल हो जाता है, और वो सारा पानी वहीं पे कंज्यूम हो जाता है। बारिशों का पानी कभी इस गांव में खड़ा नहीं होता है, क्योंकि इतनी छोटी सेटिंग है। तो एक्सपेंशन मेरे ज़हन में ये आती है कि ऐसी सेटिंग्स में, और जो शहरों की बहुत बड़े शहर अगर बनाते हैं, तो उससे कितने ज़्यादा मसले होते हैं। तो उसके अलावा बहुत सारे आगे मैं क्विकली बात करता हूँ उनके ऊपर, जो ऐसे फील्ड के अंदर जितने भी मेरे विजिट्स हैं, उनके अंदर जो बहुत से पॉइंट्स हैं नोट करने के काबिल। एक ये है कि अगर वो कहीं पर भी काम कर रहे हैं, तो या अगर वो खेती कर रहे हैं या टेक्सटाइल प्रैक्टिसेस वो अपनी कर रहे हैं, तो उसके साथ उनके आसपास जो नेचर के और एलिमेंट्स हैं, जो दूसरी स्पीशीज़ हैं, उनके बारे में भी कितने वो माइंडफुल रहते हैं। अगर भैंसों का दूध निकालते हैं, तो हमेशा ये ख्याल रखते हैं कि उसके अंदर दूध रहे जो भैंस का बछड़ा भी पी सके। फिर मुझे याद है कि मेरे दादा से मुझे बचपन में बात बताते थे कि अगर और वही वाली बात मैंने बाद में कराची में एक साहब थे, सवात या कलाम से आए हुए थे, उन्होंने भी इसी से मिलती जुलती बात बताई कि उनके बड़ों ने उनको बताया कि जब बीज बोते थे खेत के अंदर, तो वो पहला दाना ज़मीन में डालते हुए ये कहते थे कि ये ज़मीन के अंदर के कीड़ों के लिए है। फिर दूसरा दाना ज़मीन के अंदर डालते थे और ये कहते थे कि ये ज़मीन के ऊपर जो कीड़े होंगे उनके लिए है। फिर तीसरा दाना डालते थे और ये कहते थे कि ये जो ऊपर से परिंदे आएंगे वो खा लें, या अगर कोई राह चलते जानवर या राह चलते लोग अगर इस फसल में से कुछ तोड़ के खाना चाहिए तो उनके लिए है। और चौथा दाना बीजते हुए कहते थे कि ये अब मेरा रिस्क है। तो ये जो अप्रोच है कि हमने ज़मीन से कुछ प्रोड्यूस करना है, निकालना है, लेकिन उसको निचोड़ना नहीं है, और दूसरे नेचर के एलिमेंट्स के लिए भी वहाँ पे चीज़ें बाकी बची रहें। फिर एक बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट चीज़ सेंस ऑफ कम्युनिटी की है कि रूरल सेटिंग्स में जो कम्युनिटीज़ रहती हैं वो उनकी ज़्यादातर काम बहुत कम्युनल होते हैं। ये लेफ़्ट साइड पे ये खेस बुनने वाले बहुत से आर्टिसंस हैं और उनके पास काम करने वाले हैं। वो बाद में फ़ौरन हमने उनके इंटरव्यूज़ किए और उनको डॉक्यूमेंट किए और वो यहाँ पर खेलने लग गए, और उस काम के दौरान भी वो आपस में एक दूसरे से गपशप कर रहे हैं, जो कि उनको बहुत से एक दूसरे को शेर सुना रहे हैं, कुछ हंस रहे हैं, कुछ गा रहे हैं। औरतें भी इसी तरह से अगर मिल के काम करती हैं। तो इसी से जो सिहाम ने एक इंट्रोडक्शन में बताया कि हमने एक कलेक्टिव बनाया है तरिंजन के नाम से। तो तरिंजन भी एक एज ओल्ड प्रैक्टिस है, जो इसी का नाम है, कम्युनल प्रैक्टिसेस का, और लोग इकट्ठे होकर कहीं बैठकर काम करें, यूजुअली औरतों का, बिकॉज तरिंजन त्री इज तरी तरीमत विच इज वुमेन, एंड जन जनी लोग, सो इट्स वुमेन काइंड लिटरली। तो तरिंजन ऐसे कलेक्टिव्स और ऐसी पब्लिक स्पेसेस होती रही हैं जहाँ पर औरतें मिलकर इकट्ठी होती हैं, वो अपने काम करती हैं, टेक्सटाइल के, खाने बनाने के और भी, और इसके दौरान अपनी सारे मसाइल एक दूसरे से शेयर करती हैं। ये राइट साइड पर बगदड़ों में रिली बनाने वाली औरतें हैं, और इन औरतों ने अपने इंटरव्यू में ये बात बोली कि हम ये रिलियाँ जो बनाती हैं अब तो बहुत ज़्यादा लोग ख़रीदते भी नहीं है क्योंकि इसमें बहुत मेहनत लगती है, लेकिन हम ये काम इसलिए नहीं छोड़ते क्योंकि ये हमारा वो टाइम है जब हम अपने घरों की सारी रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटीज से निकल कर एक दूसरे से मिलती हैं और रिलैक्स होकर घरों को वापस आती हैं। तो ये जो पूरा प्रोसेस है, इट्स वेरी थेरेपेटिकल। तो इसी से इंस्पायर होकर ये हम लोगों ने ये एक तरिंजन के नाम से कलेक्टिव भी बनाया, जिसमें उसी को प्रैक्टिस करने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं कि हम अपने जो यूजुअल सेटिंग्स हैं क्लासरूम्स की, उनसे निकल कर, अपने कंफर्ट जोन से निकल कर नेचर के पास कहीं जाकर और ऐसी सेटिंग्स में सब मिलकर एक दूसरे से कनेक्ट करें, और उसके थ्रू फिर जो हमारे मसाइल हैं, जिसमें सबसे बड़ा एक क्लाइमेट चेंज का इशू है, उससे कैसे उसको डील करना है, उसके ऊपर भी डिस्कशंस हों। एक और सीखने लायक चीज़ ट्रांसपेरेंसी है, जो कि जो प्रोडक्शन प्रोसेसेस हैं, जो घर बनते हैं शहरों में, जो खाने हम खाते हैं, जो कपड़े हम पहनते हैं, हम अगर कपड़े भी पहनते हैं तो उसको एक क्लिक के साथ ऐड टू कार्ट करते हैं, हमें नहीं पता कि किन प्रोसेसेस से और गुजर के हमारे तक पहुंचा है, और इसके दौरान माहौल और लोगों को कितना ज़्यादा नुकसान पहुंचा है। तो ट्रांसपेरेंसी रूरल सेटिंग्स में क्यों नज़र आती है? क्योंकि ट्रांसपेरेंसी ट्रेसेबिलिटी से आती है और उनके प्रोसेसेस स्ट्रीमलाइंड हैं और ट्रेसेबल हैं, और हम ये देख सकते हैं कि कहाँ से उन्होंने मटेरियल सोर्स किया है और फाइनल प्रोडक्ट बनने तक वो किन प्रोसेस से गुजरा है। तो ये एक सीखने लायक बात है कि हमें ट्रांसपेरेंसी और ट्रेसेबिलिटी इंश्योर करनी है अगर हमें वाकई किसी चीज़ को सस्टेनेबल बनाना है और वो ग्रीन वॉश नहीं है, और वो अगर कोई सोल्यूशन हो सकती है। मुझे ये भी कुछ वहीं से पिक्चर्स हैं जो भिक्षा में ब्लॉक प्रिंटिंग करते हैं, वो कौन से मटेरियल्स यूज़ करते हैं, उनके पास उसका पूरा एक ट्रेल होता है। मुझे इससे भी याद आ रहा है कि मेरी दादी बचपन में ये अक्सर कहा करती थी कि बल्कि वो उन्होंने सारी ज़िंदगी सब्ज़ी कोई वो नहीं खाई जिसका उन्हें नहीं पता कि वो किस फील्ड से आई है, और वो ज़मीन से निकलने से उन तक पहुँचने और उनके पेट तक पहुँचने तक किन प्रोसेसेस से गुजरी है। तो क्या हमारे सारे जो फूड साइकिल्स हैं वो इतनी ट्रेसेबल हैं? तो ये भी एक वहाँ से सीखने लायक बात है। फिर जो उनके डिज़ाइंस हैं वो किस तरह से नेचर से इंस्पायर्ड होते हैं, और नेचर से इंस्पायर होना क्या करता है, इसके ऊपर मैं आगे बात करता हूँ। डिज़ाइन सेंसिबिलिटी, ये कोमल सलमान फोकलोरिस्तान से जिनका एक दिन पहले उनका सेशन था, और वो ये बात कर रही थी कि बहुत सा जो मॉडर्न और कंटेम्प्रेरी डिज़ाइन है उसको हम उसको डिज़ाइन कहते हैं, और वो आर्ट है, और जो कम्युनिटीज़ का और जो आर्टिसान्स का काम है उसको अगर डिज़ाइन या आर्ट नहीं कहा जाता, तो ये और क्यों नहीं कहा जाता, तो ज़्यादातर ये होता है कि क्योंकि वो उसके अंदर कोई डिज़ाइन सेंसिबिलिटी नहीं है, वो एस्थेटिकली प्लीजिंग नहीं है। इस तरह की बातें बहुत ज़्यादा ये डिस्कशंस होती रहती हैं। इस पर भी निहाल ने पहले सेशन में ये डिटेल से डिस्कस किया था कि इनफॉर्मल और फॉर्मल डिज़ाइन दोनों किस तरह से डिज़ाइन हैं। तो ये इनफॉर्मल डिज़ाइंस के एग्जांपल्स हैं जो कम्युनिटीज़ के अपने हैं। लेफ़्ट साइड पर एक घर के दरवाजे के ऊपर बनाए गए डिज़ाइंस हैं जो कि इंडिविजुअलिस्टिक हैं, यूनिक हैं, उनके घर पे ऐसे डिज़ाइन हैं, और एक स्टेटमेंट है जो किसी और के घर पे नहीं होगी। राइट साइड पे भी इसी तरह एक और घर के ऊपर मुख्तलिफ डिज़ाइन हैं, और दरमियान में एक दरवाजे का डिज़ाइन है जिसके अंदर अगेन नेचर से ही कुछ लिए गए एलिमेंट्स हैं, फूल और परिंदे, और नीचे शमसा है जो एक सूरज का निशान है, जो कि हमारे आर्किटेक्चर में बहुत ज़्यादा इस्तेमाल हुआ है, लेकिन हर जगह बहुत यूनिकली इस्तेमाल होता है, और इस दरवाजे में भी बहुत मुख्तलिफ तरह से इस्तेमाल हुआ है। फिर उनकी कलर चॉइसेस अब शहरों में दो मतलब अभी भी शहर के लोगों से ही वो इन्फ्लुएंस्ड होकर गांव के लोग भी रंग पहनना छोड़ते जा रहे हैं, क्योंकि हमने अपने आप को बहुत ज़्यादा ग्रे, ब्लैक और एसीटोन्स में ही लिमिट कर लिया है। तो किस तरह से वो लोग रंग पहनते हैं और वो पूरी लैंडस्केप में कितने खूबसूरत लगते हैं। राइट साइड पे जो कि मर्दों के लिए हमारे यहाँ वैसे अर्बन सेटिंग्स में रंग पहनने थोड़े से मायूब समझे जाते हैं। दरमियान में उनकी एक एक्सेसरी है जो कि मिरर को ढांपने का एक पर्दा है, और लेफ्ट साइड पर एक ड्रेपिंग स्टाइल है जो उन्होंने मुझे ये इनमें दो जो आपको ख़वातीन नज़र आ रही हैं, इसमें रेड दुपट्टे वाला मैं हूँ, और लेफ़्ट साइड पर उस घर की मैट्रियार्क हैं जिन्होंने मुझे ये ड्रेप करना सिखाया और मुझे बताया कि ये ड्रेपिंग किस तरह से उन्होंने डेवलप की है, क्योंकि सहरा में रहती हैं और ऊपर से सूरज होता है, लेकिन हवा बहुत तेज़ चल रही होती है। लेकिन अगर आप सूरज में हों तो आपको गर्मी लगती है। हवा को आप कैसे यूटिलाइज़ कर सकते हैं, तो उन्होंने नीचे एक घाघरा पहना होता है, एक स्कर्ट जो काफ़ी वोल्यूमिनस है, और उसके अंदर हवा आके उनकी बॉडी के गिर्द घूम रही है, और अपनी चेस्ट के ऊपर उन्होंने कपड़े से अपनी चेस्ट को ढांपा है, और पेट और उनका कमर नंगी है, और इस दुपट्टे को ड्रेप करके उन्होंने अपने गिर्द यूँ बांधा है, जो इस पिक्चर में थोड़ा सा नज़र आ रहा है, कि जिससे वो एक एयर कैचिंग बैलून बन जाता है। तो हवा एक तरफ से एंटर होती है सहरा में चलते हुए, दूसरी तरफ से निकल जाती है, तो थ्रू आउट आपको एक वेंटिलेशन मिलती जाती है। और इसके मैं बस कंक्लूड कर रहा हूँ इन अ मिनट और टू। उसके बाद एक बहुत बड़ा कंपैरिजन जो है, मैं कपड़ों पे ज़्यादा इसलिए बात कर रहा हूँ बिकॉज़ मैं कपड़ों पे काम करता हूँ, कि एम्बॉडीड एनर्जीज़ का है उन चीज़ों की जो घर बनते हैं उनकी, फूड की और कपड़ों की। तो ये लेफ़्ट साइड पर एक ख़ास तरह का माहौल है जहाँ पर कपड़े बनते हैं इंडस्ट्रियली, और वो अगर हमारे पास आते हैं या तो हमें उनके प्रोसेस का पता नहीं होता कि किन से गुजर के गए हैं, और अगर हमें पता हो और हमें ये पता हो कि किस तरह से वो कपड़े बने हैं तो उसकी नेगेटिव एनर्जी किस तरह हमारे साथ आती है। राइट साइड के ऊपर एक मजनू केस है जो मेरी अम्मा की डावरी का है, जो मेरे नाना के खेतों की इंडिजिनस कॉटन को सालों में चुनकर उन्होंने इतनी कलेक्ट की जिससे काफ़ी सारे खेस बन सकें, और उसको उनके घर में चरखे पर हैंड स्पन करके धागे बनाए गए, और उसको एक रंगसाज ने डाई किया, और फिर एक जुलाहे को वीवर को दिया गया जिसने ये वीव किए, और फिर ये इस तरह का पैटर्न का खेस बना। तो इस कपड़े की क्या वैल्यू होगी, इसके साथ जुड़े हुए जो ये सारी जितने हाथों ने इस पे काम किया है, जिसकी एसोसिएशन है, वो कितना वैल्यू उसको करता है, और उस वजह से हम उसको डिस्कार्ड भी उस तरह से नहीं करेंगे जिस तरह से हम फास्ट फैशन को डिस्कार्ड करते हैं और बहुत ज़्यादा कंज्यूम करते हैं, जो कि बहुत बड़ा मसला है। फिर केयर की प्रैक्टिसेस हैं जो रूरल कम्युनिटीज़ में बहुत ज़्यादा नज़र आती हैं, कि कपड़ों को किस तरह संभाल के वो रखते हैं जिससे उनकी लाइफ भी बढ़ती है। फिर अगर वो कपड़े पहनने के काबिल नहीं रहते, फट जाते हैं, तो उसको कैसे अपसाइकिल करते हैं, उससे रिलियाँ बनती हैं, और जो बहुत ही बिल्कुल कपड़े मर जाते हैं उनसे रिलियों की फिलिंग होती है। और ये केयर प्रैक्टिसेस कपड़ों की या किसी भी चीज़ की हमें शहरों में नज़र बहुत कम आती है। फिर एक उनकी जो उनकी मिथोलॉजी है, जो उनके बिलीफ सिस्टम्स हैं, वो किस तरह से उन प्रैक्टिसेस उनको जोड़े रखे हुए हैं। ये दम्बूरा है, ये शाह जो फ़कीर हैं जो वो उसको और गिलाफ में लपेटा हुआ उन्होंने दम्बूरे को, और उसके साथ जो उन्होंने बहुत एक प्यार से सेहरे बनाए हुए लेफ्ट साइड पे, जो एक लटकने वाली एक ऑर्नामेंटेशन है जो दम्बूरे को लगती है, जिसको वो सेहरा बोलते हैं। फिर वो जो इसमें कुछ पिक्चर्स मिसिंग हैं, अपने अलम भी बनाते हैं, और ताबूतों के ऊपर देने वाले केस हैं वो भी खुद किस रेफरेंस से वीव करते हैं। और मैं जल्दी से आपको एक ये बताना चाह रहा था कि एक सूसी वीवर से हम लोग मिले इसी तरह एक गांव में, और उन्होंने मुझे बताया कि
अब्दुल, मैं
मुझे
आपको माजरत चाहूंगी कि प्लीज रैप अप कर दें।
ठीक है, हाँ, इसको फिर छोड़ लेते हैं। ये कुछ चीज़ें हैं कि किस तरह से उनके जो कलर स्कीम्स हैं उससे इंस्पायर होके ये मैंने कुछ कपड़े डिज़ाइन किए हैं कि वो क्यों ये कलर स्कीम्स इस्तेमाल करते हैं, किस तरह वो नेचर के अगेंस्ट एक स्टेटमेंट नहीं देना चाहते, बल्कि उसके अंदर घुलती मिलती भी एक स्टेटमेंट देना चाहते हैं। ये कुछ अगेन ऐसी रूरल कम्युनिटीज से इंस्पायर होकर, बिकॉज वहाँ पे प्रिंट बहुत ज़्यादा पहनते मैंने देखा, और मैंने देखा कि अब कम हो गए हैं, तो कुछ प्रिंटेड कपड़े डिज़ाइन किए थे, जिसने एक ट्विटर पे बहुत बड़ी डिबेट स्टार्ट की कि ये कपड़े शायद नहीं पहनना चाहिए। लेकिन ऐसी कंट्रोवर्शियल डिबेट्स मुझे ऐसा लगता है हमेशा एक अपॉर्चुनिटी देती हैं डिस्कशन की, जिस पर एक बहुत ज़्यादा डिस्कशन हुई कि किस तरह से ये कपड़े कॉलोनाइज होने से पहले यहाँ पे सब लोग पहनते रहे। आखिर में एक झंडा है, ये मुझे काफ़ी उम्मीद दिलाता है इतनी होपलेस और डिसअपॉइंटिंग सर्कमस्टांसेस में, क्योंकि ये झंडा भी मेरी अम्मा ने अपनी पिकनिक उनको जोड़ के बनाया था। इसकी स्टेटमेंट मुझे महसूस होती रही है जो स्टैंडर्डाइज फॉर्म ऑफ फ्लैग से बहुत डिफरेंट है, कि उसके अंदर अपनी मर्जी की जो अलम बनाने का ऑर्नामेंटेशन है वो भी करें। तो ये कुछ चीज़ें हैं जो, और इसके अंदर एक पैटर्न है कि अपने आप को उस कल्चर से जोड़े रखना, और उस ज़बान से, उन फोक ट्रेडिशन से, उन गीतों से, उन शायरी से, जो उन प्रैक्टिसेस से भी जोड़े रखता है, क्योंकि लोकलाइज प्रैक्टिसेस हमारे लोकल प्रॉब्लम्स के लिए बहुत ज़रूरी हैं, ना कि जो कि एक ग्लोबल पर्सपेक्टिव है कि ग्लोबल दुनिया में सब प्रॉब्लम्स का एक ग्लोबलाइज सोल्यूशन होगा। थैंक यू फॉर टुडे।
बहुत शुक्रिया। Thank you so much, Abdul. You can stop sharing the screen. Thank you so much. I know we've gone a little above the time. I really appreciate everyone's patience here. But अब हमारी आखिरी speaker हैं. Baneen, are you around? Hello, Baneen. I
I'm
know with all the tough circumstances, thank you so much for taking our time.
Thank you so
सही
much.
चल रहा है पीछे सब कुछ इंटरनेट अभी?
So far, so good. Let's see how
Okay,
long
fine.
it goes.
Okay, I know that we're completely off our time right now, but we didn't realize that how every space took like more than what we had expected. But hopefully, over to you. Please introduce Baneen.
Okay. Hello, Baneen. Welcome. Thank you for being here. Baneen Mirza is a photographer and co-founder of Khana Badosh Petra, a communal space in Gilgit-Baltistan, and a lived inquiry into the relationship between travel, sustainability, and indigenous wisdoms. With a focus on food, ecological practices, and the kitchen as a site of knowledge, she extends this inquiry through visual and edible mediums to explore what it means to live and learn in relation to land and its people. Okay, over to you, Baneen.
Great. Thank you, Siham. Thank you, Marvi. Thank you to the panelists who went before me, and Abdul Rehman for the urban development photos. They set the context somewhat for where I'm about to take you. I will I'll share my screen in a minute. Please bear with me. Acha. Right. All right, can you guys see the screen?
Yes.
Lovely. So this was Rewilding Death. This project was basically a very short photo essay that I did for Seven, which is a visual storytelling and photojournalism organization. But thanks to the research that I did for the essay, it has since become, an expanded ongoing query. I'm going to quickly read the overview, sort of introduction of the project, and then I will walk you through some of the elements and some of the facets that have come across in this project and in the graveyard to speak about ecology in reference to today's discussion. So we are at Miani Sahib, which is Lahore's largest graveyard, which acts as an unexpected sanctuary for medicinal flora. In a city where natural habitats are disappearing, this urban ecoregion holds ethnobotanical value and serves as a foraging ground for medicinal herbs, foraged by graveyard workers or nearby residents to earn supplementary income or for use in their own kitchens. In the market, these herbs find their way into the hands of pansars and hakims. The story traces this movement of herbs from the graveyard to the market and explores the textures that unfold in between. Due to spiritual and cultural beliefs, graveyards experience lower disturbance and destruction, providing relatively stable habitats for plants enriched by nutrients from human body decomposition, fostering a diverse ecosystem. Despite its potential for conservation and research, aligning with the resurgence in holistic healing and supporting traditional healing methods, Miani Sahib faces encroachment and targeted weed removal, posing a threat to its natural plant diversity. The threat extends to the history and cultural legacy that these plants embody. Tied to their local names are perspectives, wisdom, medicinal and culinary uses, as well as references in literature. The threat extends to an embodiment of an entire way of life. The narrative seeks to reconnect with these ideas, using graveyards as an unconventional intersection for these practices and as silent participants in sustaining life. It contemplates our place in ecological balance, in rewilding, and the emergence of life and life-giving herbs from death. So these pictures that I have been sort of showing you are from the graveyard, just to give you a sense of where we are located, and this is in the center of Lahore city. I will now bring you to this one person, because this sanctuary is not a garden by design. It is shaped by, I guess, grief and ritual and community and what would be considered neglect in a way, because a lot of these plants that I'm talking about, this flora, they're all weeds and not, planted on purpose. Well, most of them. So this here is Parveen Akhtar, who was my first sort of friend and guide, who sort of showed me around the graveyard and, acquainted me to sort of the ways of the graveyard. She also took me around and showed me herbs that she was familiar with in terms of their medicinal uses. And she also knew which ones were poisonous. She has been working here for nearly 14 years and she kind of feels this is kind of like a second home to her. And in showing me around one afternoon, we prepared a meal from this saag, pilak ka saag, that we foraged from the graveyard. And it was very interesting how she foraged the saag. We got the firewood from the graveyard also. We gathered the bricks that were used in the making of the graves. And it all sort of came together to make this makeshift kitchen, and we prepared a meal. So I'm going to now quickly move through images of her doing that. So this is the saag, and literally she's plucking it off a grave, gathering the wood. and that was the meal ready. And now these are some other just textures and from around the graveyard, how roots sort of make their way into the graves. People would come and offer bajra and feed to the birds. So birds, there's a lot of sort of this a very active bird and animal wildlife here as well. I don't have enough photographs of that, but just to give you a sense. This photograph, for instance, so a lot of times when people offer roses on either the shrines or on the graves, there are a lot of shrines in this graveyard as well. So women in the area would collect those roses and they would lay them out to dry them in the sun. And this is one of the sort of one of the things that then gets collected and sold in herb markets. So they would go to pansars to make gulkand or to make itar, etc. So these knowledges, about graveyards and what grows there, and particularly Miani Sahib, is not something new. This has I wanted to reference this document in this paper, which was carried out by some students from GCU and University of Sargodha, where they have, at Miani Sahib in particular, identified over 30 plant species. These herbs serve a range of traditional medicinal purposes, treating all kinds of ailments, respiratory, wound healing, pain relief, inflammation, and even veterinary use. And they've also identified wood that is rich in oil and good for lighting fire. They concluded that graveyards like Miani Sahib act as important gene pools of medicinal plants, and that they could be used as urban botanical fields for research and conservation. But this conservation, they stress, must involve the local communities that have long acted as stewards of these spaces. So talking about these plants are, of course, not nameless. They are known, spoken to, sung about, and the language we use to name them holds a lot of power. These are just images from this one exhibition. I tried to sort of, just to sort of lay out all this information that I had gathered, and I continue to sort of study. So what came up here is that calling a plant by its local name, so for instance, Kawar Gandal instead of aloe vera, restores cultural agency. When you refer to Aakh ka phool, Kikar ki phalli, Van ka darakht, ya Gond, you're invoking generations of knowledge passed down through oral traditions, caretaking, and embodied experience, because certain things, if you name them in a language alien to you, you will not be able to tap into that repository of knowledge that oral tradition has, or sort of people carry with them, which also goes on to emphasize this act of naming also directly counters colonial legacy. So internationally, scientists and curators have examined this, and they have studied botanical collections, and they have found that while most of the world's plant diversity exists in the global south, the majority of these specimens are housed in North American and European herbariums. This imbalance, they would say, is the afterlife of colonial extraction. Biodiversity was collected, catalogued, and centralized far from the communities who nurtured it. And these people, these scientists, are advocating for a shift that biodiversity, they argue, can be best studied where it occurs, and that indigenous and local peoples must be central to the herbariums with respect to the sovereignty of their biological resources, knowledge, their culture, and interests. So these are again some of the fruits and plants that I found there. This is at the shop at a Pansar's. A shop like this is basically where my essay started, because I found these to be these really interesting encyclopedias of what is grown and what is used in our alternative and traditional medicinal practices. And that is what led me to a graveyard, or to Miani Sahib in particular. And these people, you know, their understanding of medicine is through these names, and they would reference books also in a certain language, because we're also looking at a certain, I guess, knowledge base, which is either not recognized in by Western medicine or mainstream medicine, and perhaps not translated. I'm not sure how all this knowledge will translate in a different language, and what it would mean if, let's say now, organizations like WHO are beginning to, World Health Organization, are beginning to regulate and recognize alternate practices. But will that mean we will lose the mohalle wala sort of, you know, the sort of grandfather kind of Hakim person? Will they have access to the kind of resources that will be required to fulfill those regulations? But anyways, I digress. Speaking of books and plant knowledge, has also been passed down in poetry. Heer by Waris Shah, which is what we have open here in this photograph, was written around 1766. It is not only a Punjabi romantic epic, but it turns out is also a rich ethnographic text that offers insights into the daily life, values, and knowledge systems of 18th century Punjab. Among these, the references to herbs and healing, though not systematically presented, reveal how herbal knowledge was culturally embedded, accessible to the layperson, and woven into both everyday life and metaphor. So there are various places wherein either Ranjha is claiming to be an expert on certain herbs, or Sehti is, you know, in response to him, his claims, I don't know, challenging him, or there's an instance of him healing Heer of a snake bite, etc. And interestingly, I was acquainted to this reference by a member of a community that gathers at the fringes of the graveyard, which brings me to this one practice that happens at one of the shrines in the graveyard of preparing bhang. This bhang is mostly grown there. The neem log that we see here is also from a tree from the graveyard. And even though the pictures here are of the process of making bhang, but what happens is that the workers, this is kind of I'm told that this is maybe a century old, decades old ritual tied to the shrine. And the preparation and communal consumption of this beverage, this ritual, has become a unifying activity, bringing together graveyard workers, devotees, nearby residents, and elders from all walks of life. And this may be seen as a taboo practice in society, yet it brings together all these people who seem to be deeply connected to the soil beneath their feet, and to stories like Heer, which, well, that's how I at least learned about it. It also makes me think that in graveyards, and at least at Miani Sahib, I noticed that a lot of the people who exist at the margins of society end up finding refuge there. So I'm interested, it got me interested in the idea of weeds, literally the plant growth, but also these sort of cultural association or social associations with what is undesirable or not in the right place. So for instance, in the logic of beautification and urban development, we want weeds removed. Even at the graveyard, there's a drive currently to clear space and bring about some order. But what is a weed? Whether in the wrong place, of no beauty, or without use, if a plant does not behave according to our designs and desires, it is a weed. Truth is, they're nature's most resilient agents. They diversify monocultures and care for the nature we destroy. They sprout from between the cracks and are almost unstoppable, which is perhaps something we fear, something we can't control. What is it about wild, untamed growth? What is it about wilderness that we are so scared of? Is it possible that it is between these cracks that radical ideas about how we imagine societies could emerge? This is, yeah, so we return with this slide to death, another thing, at least I'm scared of. We return to the graveyard, not as an end point, but as a site of transformation. This particular photograph is not from Miani Sahib, but from another graveyard in Rawalpindi. I just find this photograph so powerful about how nature takes over, can take over, and kind of we kind of become a part of nature rather than apart from it. It's almost sad, but very powerful and poignant in some sense. Yeah, so just in the graveyard, the idea that our bodies decompose to provide nutrients to the soil, foster biodiversity, and open door for untamed life to emerge, for these sites to be such sort of interesting locations for all these knowledges and communities, and for them to be I think the most alive than any other sort of parts of the city. And it takes for humans to be dead and for it to sort of happen and take place. And that graveyard becomes not a place of finality, but of emergence in some sense. And to bring it back also to the subject of this session, to resist climate colonialism is perhaps to protect what grows between the cracks in these anomalies, in these sort of unexpected places. Perhaps it is also to remember in the language of our grandmothers. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Baneen. This last photograph is so powerful, and it's a moment of encounter. Thank you for sharing. And deep down, I was really praying hard that you will be here. And especially when the Palak photographs that you were, I wish we had gone a little bit more slower.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
As slow as how you showed us the bhang process. So that would have really kind of merged together, but really.
Would you like
really
to see
enjoyed.
them again?
No,
don't know about that.
we'll watch it. We'll have the recording so we can go. I just want to get into the questions, but yes, I would love to see them again, and I think I would sit with you and see them again. So thank you again. This was beautiful, and like I said when I met you a few weeks ago, that this body of work of yours is really a moment of slowness and also a moment of encountering what it means to look at land and its ecology. It's almost like a study in silence. So really, really enjoyed it. Thank you so much, Baneen. So let's open the questions now. I know we are like a little bit above the time, but let's open and ask the internal questions first, and then maybe we can move into audience queries.
Yeah. Okay. So we have a few questions from our team. I'll read them out first, and then if the audience members have any questions, please drop them in the chat box, or later on you can also like unmute your mics and speak to the speakers directly if we have time. So the first question is for Palvasha. The people of Balochistan are being disappeared and erased. Climate injustices extend to a systematic severance of people from their indigenous lands, from Gwadar to Gaza. From your experience in the field, are there any laws that uphold climatic justice, or do they hold weight in the face of adversity?
Thank you so much for that. I'm very grateful for this question, particularly because it's an opportunity to talk about how these concerns are so deeply tied to the political and so deeply tied to the political economy, really, of violence, that I mean, not just climactic violence, but just visceral militaristic violence. Unfortunately, to come to the question itself, There are, of course, laws against enforced disappearances. There is a commission in Islamabad that is supposed to look at these cases. There are also laws as far as environmental management goes. There are provincial commissions on environmental management. Technically, every building that's constructed beyond a certain height has to get approval from the environmental commissions. It's called the Environmental Protection Authority. For each province, it's a CPA or a PPA or BPA or so forth. Similarly, public works projects such as bridges, highways, etc., have to get similar approvals. These entail detailed assessments called environmental impact assessments. In addition to that, there is, of course, an extensive body of laws that looks at irrigation and drainage management. Unfortunately, when it comes to development projects, it often amounts to not much. When one looks at the kind of relationship, and that's why this question is very interesting, between, say, the laws against enforced disappearances or the laws for environmental protection, one sees strange continuities also in not just the lack of political will and so forth, but also where that will is employed. When the Environmental Protection Agency or the the NDMA, which also looks at natural disasters at this point, or the police or the commission against the enforced disappearances becomes active, and when it does not, who it's okay to lose and who it's not okay to lose. When urban Pakistanis are disappeared, of course, it's a very different reaction to when rural Pakistanis are disappeared. When urban Baloch are disappeared, of course, they still get a little bit better visibility than when rural Baloch are disappeared. And in fact, a lot of this is also concurrent with the spread of arms, with the spread of drugs, illicit trade, and a lot of these developmentalist impulses that, of course, we've seen coming to a head in Gwadar and other CPEC related projects. I think I'm going on too long and we already have little time, so I'm going to stop here. I'm happy to talk further after this, if you want.
Thank you so much, Palvasha. The next question is for Abdul Rehman. How do you navigate the tension between sustainability and accessibility, especially when slow fashion is often seen as a luxury? Where is the world of textile headed in Pakistan?
हाँ, ये मुझे लगता है कि काफ़ी एक अहम डिबेट है, जो अक्सर एक काउंटर क्वेश्चन होता है कि अफोर्डेबल नहीं होगा सस्टेनेबल फ़ैशन। इसके लिए भी मुझे लगता है सवाल के जवाब के लिए भी मुझे फील्ड में जाना पड़ा और मैंने वहाँ पे देखा कि कैसे लोग अफोर्ड करते हैं ऐसे कपड़े। तो मुझे वहाँ से ये समझ आई है कि सस्ते कपड़े हमारी ज़रूरत इस जगह के लोगों की कभी भी नहीं रहे। सस्ते कपड़े ज़रूरत उस मॉडल, उस सिस्टम की है जहाँ पर आपने फॉर एग्ज़ाम्पल अमेरिका में भी रिसेंट एक स्टडी है कि हर हफ्ते एक ऑन एवरेज एक बंदा एक नया जोड़ा खरीदता है और 75 to 85% जो लोग हैं वो एक दफ़ा पहन कर ही डिस्कार्ड कर देते हैं। तो ये एक जो फास्ट फैशन का जो सिस्टम है, जहाँ पर इतने ज़्यादा आपने कपड़े चेंज करने, आपको बहुत ज़्यादा चाहिए, आपने रिपीट नहीं करने, हर इंस्टाग्राम पिक्चर में आपको एक नया जोड़ा चाहिए, वहाँ पर आपको सस्ते कपड़े चाहिए। लेकिन ये सॉल्यूशन इसका भी हमें इंडिजिनस कम्युनिटीज़ से मिलता है कि वहाँ पर उनके पास एक शॉल इतनी वर्सेटाइल है, इतने तरह से इस्तेमाल हो सकती है, सारी उम्र वो एक शॉल वो पहन सकते हैं। हमारे पास बहुत से ऐसे कपड़े हैं, इवन हमारे आसपास लोगों के जो आर्टिस्ट कम्युनिटी में मारवी, बनीन को मैंने ऐसे कपड़े पहनते देखा जो मुख्तलिफ तरह से स्टाइल करती हैं, ऐसे स्टेटमेंट पीसेस हैं। तो मैं ये आई मीन इट्स नॉट हाइपरबोलिक स्टेटमेंट, इट्स रिसर्च के बाद मैं इस नतीजे पे पहुंचा हूँ कि अफोर्डेबिलिटी जो है वो एक उस तरह से ज़रूरत नहीं जिस तरह से हमारे ऊपर ये कॉन्सेप्ट लादा गया है कि आपको सस्ते कपड़े चाहिए क्योंकि बहुत ज़्यादा चाहिए। सो सस्टेनेबल कपड़े और थोड़े कपड़े, अच्छे कपड़े, इन्वायरमेंट, सोशली एंड इन्वायरमेंटली सस्टेनेबल कपड़े, वो हमारी ज़रूरत है।
Thank you, Abdul Rahman. The next question is for Baneen. Food and foraging often involve intergenerational transmission of knowledge. In your opinion, are these rituals being threatened by climate shifts, and how can we protect them?
I will ask you to repeat that question one more time, please.
Food and foraging often involve intergenerational transmission of knowledge. In your opinion, are these rituals being threatened by climate shifts, and how can we protect them?
Yes, they are being affected by climate change. That's mostly because we are growing. I mean, climate change is caused by, among other things, well, not caused by, but one of the factors is that we have shifted to monocultures. We have drastically affected biodiversity. And this is true for cities, of course, but even where I am right now in Hunza, I see the shift happening with, increasing tourism and people wanting to build more and more and compromise not only just green areas in general, but also what they choose to grow. Depending, they will now grow instead of the greens that they have been using historically, consuming historically, they would now choose to grow what will sell. And what will sell is, of course, we know what that is determined by and whatever the demand is. Yeah, I do think in that sense we need to grow more of all kinds of produce and grains and plants and weeds even. When I was researching this particular essay, I also came across this actually for the sake of biodiversity. Good to maybe even have a small graveyard as we would in rural areas. And Abdul Rahman would have, I'm sure, come across this in his research and his life as well, where people would have their own ancestral graveyards, and usually they would leave the flora around it as is, and they would have their agricultural land close by. I'm forgetting the sort of scientific sort of study behind it, but that apparently helped the kind of sort of plants and insects those weeds would attract, would be beneficial for what was being grown in the agricultural fields. So and all of that is shifting because even these graveyards are now being, they're using pesticides there. We're using pesticides in all the food that we are growing in general. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Baneen. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time for audience questions, so we'll move on towards the conclusion. Thank you so much to all our speakers for answering the questions in such an insightful way. Now, I will request my co-curator, Samil, to please conclude the successful session. Over to you, Samil.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being a part of today's session, focused on indigenous practices, climate change, and ecological practices in a post-colonial world. From Palvasha's perspective of indigenous versus hegemonic knowledge and importance of context in indigenous practices, to Ifra's research on climate change and its effect on built environment and the importance and need for sustainable frameworks, to Abdul Rahman's observation and anecdotes on urban versus rural life, and how we can learn from the rural people for a more sustainable world, to Baneen's study on Miami Sahib graveyard, ethnobotanical ecologies, and nature as a way for life. We have reflected upon so many ways in which we can move forward with our world to create awareness and to bring about a sustainable change, which was also a mission of today's session. So thank you guys again for being a part of this session, and I will conclude on this very happy note that we have created these conversations, and we invite you all to continue these conversations even after the end of this session. Thank you so much for being a part of Plus 91 Habitations.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for being for our last session. Here we end our this year's webinar, and we will see you next year again with a new topic and new speakers. Thank you all. Bye.